Okay, so this is lecture 5A, and we're going to start module 5, which is tutorial 7 in the textbook, and this is on forms. And forms are a way that you can get information from the users of your website and submit it to the server. Since we're not doing any server-side coding, we'll just be building the forms and they won't really submit anywhere. Okay, in order to use a form, you either have to do server-side coding like PHP, which you'll do in a couple of semesters, or sometimes you can use just JavaScript if you're just doing some calculator or game or something that just happens locally. You can just use JavaScript, and you'll be learning JavaScript next semester. So we'll leave the other side of it for now, but building the forms is a whole task in itself. So here's a preview of what our form is going to look like. And you'll see that there are a lot of different widgets or controls, as they're called in forms. So the most basic one is just like a text field where you can type text in, like your name or city or something. You'll notice that the city and state are pre-filled, meaning they have a default value, which I can change. So I can change that, for example, from Florida to Ontario. And then a couple of these have what are called placeholders, where they have this kind of shadow text. In fact, first and last name up at the top has it as well, that as soon as you start to type, it disappears. It's not actually in the field. It's just kind of a suggestion for how to fill that field out. And that's called a placeholder. So we'll be looking at that. So there's text fields, and there's different kinds of text fields, as we'll see. For example, phone numbers and emails are handled a little bit differently. Although they still just look like a text field. Down here we have a list where we can choose from that list. Okay, and over on the other side, order type, we have like a drop-down menu too. These are actually the same control, just displayed differently. One, you only see one line, and the other one you can set more than one line for it. Okay, and we'll look at that as well. Down here, the favorite dish has a suggestion list. And so I can, when I click on it, the suggestion list pops up. And as I type in it, it'll kind of narrow the search based on what I type. And I can choose that, or I can type something completely different. So I'm not bound to those lists, that selection list. Like the one above it here, where did you hear about us? I have to choose from that list. I can't enter something different. But with this one, this is called a data list, I can type in whatever I want, or I can select from the list. And as I type, it kind of narrows my search in the list so that if it's in the list, I can find it. Okay, so we'll look at that as well. This one is a number field where we can increase or decrease within a certain range or for numbers. Here we have a checkbox, which is either checked or unchecked. And so we can either, in this case, it says add me to your mailing list. So I can check it for yes or uncheck it for no. And so that's kind of a yes-no thing. And over here we have a date field. So you can see that we have a date field, and I can click on that little calendar and it'll pop up a calendar widget so that I can just select from that and choose it. That makes a nice, easy way to select a date. Although if you're going back 40 or 50 years, it can be a little tedious to click, 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 click through all the years. But you can type like something like size, I could say 1970. And then when I click the calendar, it comes up with that month, and then I can choose the day. So you can kind of do a hybrid of typing and selecting. Okay, I already mentioned this one, the select, where it pops up a list. So it takes up less space than the one on the other side because we only see the one we select. As we'll see later on, we can actually select multiple items in this one, and that's just a setting that we'll see. But it's so awkward that I never really use it because you have to hold down Shift or Control in order to select multiple ones. And most people don't know to do that, so they would only select one. They wouldn't select multiples. Okay, this other one is a radio button, and the author calls these option buttons, which I think is kind of unfortunate because I've only ever seen them called radio buttons anywhere else. They get their name from car radios where you have preset buttons, and when you select one, it basically selects that station and unselects the other radio stations. And so if I select yes, that's my answer. If I select no, it unselects yes and then selects no. So within a group of radio buttons, and you can have as many in a group as you want, here we only have 2 in each group. Within that group, you can only select one of them. Okay, so it's kind of actually very similar to this, although it's a very different element in HTML. But here I have a list of items that I can only choose one. This is just like that. I have a list of items I can only choose one, but it has a different appearance to the user. Okay, this group below it is a different group, so I can select one of this group. Okay, and so we'll see how to create those groups. Okay, and then we have a range selector down here, which is like a slider that you can slide back and forth, kind of like a volume control or something. And you can set the range for that. And here it says 0 poor, 10 great, which is kind of funny because they don't show, the range selector doesn't show the numbers. Sometimes you put the numbers in, like kind of at either end. And now I'm wondering if I missed a step. Maybe the author had us do that. We'll see when we get there. Because you might put 0 at one end and 10 at the other end so that people know what the range is, because otherwise you don't know. Okay, and then down here we have what is called a text area, and this is a larger box for typing more text in. So I can type a lot of text in there, and it's kind of unlimited how much text I can type. And it'll keep going and going and going. So if you want to, like here where it says, tell us more about your experience, and you want the person to kind of talk a little bit, it gives them that opportunity. Whereas just these text fields over on the left don't really give you that option. Although you can type as much in them as you want, it doesn't feel like you can because they have only one line. Okay, so these text areas are multiple lines, and you can type more in. Okay, and then below we have a couple of buttons, and we'll see that HTML has 3 kinds of buttons. And there's 2 of them here, 2 different kinds of buttons. One is a submit button, which will submit your form to the server. And the cancel button will reset your form. It's actually a reset button. It says cancel on it, but it's a reset button. And it resets the form back to the way it was when it was first loaded. Okay. The third kind of button is just called a button, and it doesn't do anything. So it's just a button that you can use. Then you would have to write some JavaScript in order to cause that button to do something, but you can create your own actions with the button. Okay, so we have 3 kinds of buttons: a submit button, which is the most commonly used one, a reset button, and a button, or just a nothing button. Okay, so the submit and reset buttons have actions already built into them or attached to them, and so those are the ones that are commonly used. The submit button is the most common because really, the author put this reset button here, but why would you put a reset button? You don't really want someone to accidentally clear the whole form when they filled it out, and that's what would happen. If I hit the reset, it sets it right back to the way as when the page first loaded. You don't want someone to accidentally be able to hit that, so usually it's better not to have a reset button than to have one, because if someone starts filling this out and then decides they don't want to, they can just close the window and go somewhere else. So reset buttons, in my opinion, are best avoided unless you have a good reason for putting a reset button. But the author likes to put them in just to give you some practice with them. Okay, so I wanted to give kind of a tour of what we're going to be creating so that as we go along, you'll have a vision of where we're going. Okay, and I don't think the book really has a good picture of this form, so I wanted to show it to you, what it will look like when we're done. We'll be building it up over several lectures because throughout this whole tutorial, we're just building this one form. Part of it is going to be validation, which is where we make sure that users are entering reasonable values. So for example, for name, when I click in there, you see that it's red with an X. That means that that field is required, that I have to type something in there. But as soon as I type anything in there, it's happy with that. So some of them are a little fussier than others, and we'll see that we can make them fussier than this, but this one just makes sure that it makes sure the user fills something out. So if I don't fill anything out and I try to submit the form, it'll pop up a message that says, please fill out this field. Okay, this is Chrome. This will look different in different browsers, but all browsers have this feature built into them. Okay, so that'll be kind of the last thing we do, that validation part of it. And it does require some HTML and some CSS to make that work nicely. Okay, so let's get started then. If there's any kind of questions, broad questions, just before we start, feel free to ask, or anytime through the lecture, just ask a question if you're wondering about something that I'm doing. Okay, so this is the HTML file, so I'll open this up and I'll put my name in there and the date. And we'll get started. Now, the first thing we're going to do is put a form in here. And you'll see over here we have the page, the same page we were just looking at over here. I blew this one up. I'll just make it a bit smaller so you can kind of see more of the page. That red checked background is really awful when you see that much of it. But anyway, in our page, you see that sentence that says required values are marked with an asterisk. Right there, that's where our form goes, right after that paragraph that says required values are marked with an asterisk. And then this is the footer down here. So our form will go in between those. So if we look at our HTML, we can see in this section, there's the paragraph that says required values are marked with an asterisk. And we're going to put it inside the section right after that paragraph. So right here. And I'm just going to put some extra space in there so you can see exactly where it's going, right before the closing section tag. Okay, so I'll just start it up here. Now, a form is kind of like a table. In appearance, it's not at all, but in HTML structure, it is. There's a form element that contains the form. Okay, just like there's a table element that contains the table. And then there are a lot of elements that are specific to forms that go inside of a form. Okay, so we saw that with tables, right? We had a table element, and then inside the table there was a bunch of special elements just for tables. Okay, forms are kind of like that. We have a form element, so I'll just put in a form element. Okay, and open and close values for the form element. And inside of the form element, we can put some other elements that are specific to forms. Interestingly, you can also put just about any other kind of element in a form as well. So it's not like tables where directly inside the tables, there's only a few elements that you can put. With forms, you can put any element in there. So for example, this paragraph here, I could put that inside the form. But it makes sense to not put more stuff in the form than you really need to have. But you can have things like paragraphs, sections, divs. We're going to put some divs in this one. Inside of the form, you can basically put anything in there. But then there are elements that are specific to forms that should only go inside of form, the form element. Okay, I hope that's not too confusing, but you'll see as we go. So this is our form. Now the form opening tag actually has a bunch of attributes that should be included. Okay, so there's a few of them. One uses the ID, so the author likes to put IDs on his forms, and so we're going to put an ID on it. And it's a good idea to have an ID on a form because then you can identify it. You could have potentially more than one form on a page, and you need to be able to identify a particular form, especially for your CSS, because usually forms have some kind of particular styling to each of them if you have more than one. Okay, so for example, you might have an order form on your page, but off to the side, you might have a form subscribed to our newsletter that just has a name and email or something in it. And those two forms are on the same page, but they're different. Okay. Okay, so ID is optional, but we're going to include it. Now there are some other attributes that are a little more important. One of them is called action, and this is what to do with the data from this form when we hit the submit button. okay? And this action is a URL. And we're not going to get into how that works because that's server side. And so you will learn about that when you take your PHP course in 3rd or 4th semester. So it's a ways away. But you will be doing server-side coding with PHP, which is a language used for web programming on servers, okay? Which is very different than what we're doing, which is called front-end programming or front-end coding, okay? So the action will be a URL. Now, we won't actually use this because the author gives us a little JavaScript program to include in our page, which actually prevents the form from going to the server so that we don't submit our form and then all our data is gone when we go back to it. So it prevents the form from getting submitted. We're not going to be doing any JavaScript in this course. Next semester, when you do JavaScript, you can maybe look back at this and it'll make sense to you. Although the coding the author uses is a little bit old, you'll be learning a newer way of JavaScript coding in your JavaScript course. But it serves its purpose, so don't worry too much about how it works. We will include that in a minute. So the action will be a URL. So we're going to say http://www.example.com. By the way, example.com is a reserved domain name for examples. So nobody owns example.com. It's kind of a fictitious domain name that never goes anywhere. So you can use it in examples like this where you don't really want it to work, but you just want to put a domain name or a URL for the purpose of an example, I guess. Okay, so that's just kind of a handy thing to know. And the author kind of creates a URL that looks like it might be a URL. So Red Ball is the name of our pizza company, our pizza place, and survey is what we're doing. We're doing a survey. Okay, so that's kind of what the action will look like. It will be a URL. In this case, it doesn't really matter what you put there because we're not going to actually be able to go there. Okay, and then the other item that we may want to include is method. And method is how the data is sent to the server. And you'll see this more again when you do your PHP course, when you're actually receiving the data, because how you receive it depends on how it was sent. Okay, but briefly, there are two ways, get and post. And these are what are called HTTP methods. These are part of the HTTP, the word's escaping me now, protocol, there we go, protocol that is used to send data between the browser and the server and the browser, both directions. Okay, so the two methods are quite different. With the get method, what happens is the data from the form is actually appended to the URL and sent as part of the URL. With the post method, it's actually a body that's attached to the message that's sent, and it's kind of sent as separate data. Okay, there's advantages to both, but most of the time you want to use post. Okay, we're going to use post. The advantage to get is that data is included in the URL, and therefore you can bookmark it. So for example, if you do a Google search, that Google search uses the get method. So you could do a Google search, bookmark it, and when you go back to that bookmark, you're actually doing your search again because the search criteria is part of the URL. Whereas with post, it is not. So if you bookmark a post request, it won't be part of the URL. Okay, and that's important for two reasons. One would be if you have very large amounts of content. URLs are limited in how much content they can hold. I think it's a little over 1,000 characters, 1,024 characters or something like that. There is a limit, which seems quite big until you start adding a lot of form data to it. Then it isn't so big anymore. And also for privacy, you don't want things like credit card numbers or even most other things in the URL because that also goes into the browser history. The URL goes into the browser history. And so you don't want things like credit card numbers being stored in the browser history or being able to be bookmarked or things like that. So POST is more often used for forms that contain larger amounts of data or anything that is private or could be considered private. Okay, so that's kind of a brief overview of the two methods. Okay, so very rarely would you want to use GET, but it does have its place. Okay, and search is really the place where GET is ideal. Most other things, POST would be what you'd want to use. Okay, so we have an ID, which is optional, but we're going to put it in because that'll let us target this form in our CSS. We have an action, which tells the form what to do with the data when we hit submit. And we have method, which tells it how to send the data to the server. Since we're not actually sending the data to the server, it really doesn't matter whether we use POST or GET, but we'll just stick with POST because that is what we probably should use for this form. Okay. If there's any questions about that, go ahead and ask, but we will stick with that. Okay, now I mentioned that JavaScript that the author gives us, and there is a file in there. I'm not seeing it right now. Oh, there it is, right near the top. Formsubmit.js, rb_formsubmit.js. That's a JavaScript file, and whoops, I didn't mean to open that. And there's the JavaScript file. That's a comment at the top, and there's the code at the bottom. Now, if you've taken JavaScript in your semester 1 programming course, then this probably still won't look familiar because you didn't really get into this stuff at all. But you will next semester when you do more JavaScript. You'll understand what this is doing. Although, as I mentioned, he's not doing it in the most current way, the best way for current times. But we'll just go with it because I thought about changing it, but then I thought, well, it's in the book, so just leave it the way it is because it would require me to do something a little different in my HTML. So what I'll do is I'll go to the top here, and I want to add a script tag, and the script tag is used to either include or import JavaScript. And so we're going to import that JavaScript file. And so we're going to do a script, and then we're going to say source and give the name of the file, which is rb formsubmit.js. Okay, and then we close our script tag, and then there is a closing script tag. So make sure you have a closing script tag because otherwise none of your page will probably show up. But you can't put anything in between the opening and closing script tag when you use the source attribute to import JavaScript from another file. Okay, so you may have done something similar to this in your previous course, but I think you put your JavaScript between the opening and closing script tag. But we're not going to do that. We're going to use this external JavaScript file, and that's how you do it. Okay, so we don't really need to worry about that, except to know that when I submit my form, I'll just get a little dialog box pop up that says that that all the data was valid or something like that. I forget exactly, but it means our form was submitted, and so we'll see what happens then. But it won't actually lose our page, so that if we want to play around with the form, we don't have to retype everything all over again. So it's kind of a nice idea. Okay, so back into our form down here, we're going to put some fields in our form, and I showed you those in our form here. So all these fields in web jargon, these where the user enters data is considered a field, and then the text over here that describes the field is referred to as a label. And we have some HTML markup for both labels and fields. The label is always the same, it's just label, and the fields are different depending on what kind of field they are. We have a few different types of elements for fields. Okay, so we'll see how that works. Now, inside of our form, you'll see these yellow beige-ish sort of boxes with the border around them, and the buttons at the bottom, those are all inside of our form, okay? But you can see we've got some boxes there. Now this box that is around these two sections, we have two of them, one on the left, one on the right. These are called field sets. And this is a way of grouping a bunch of fields together inside of a single element. And it'll automatically, by default, it'll put a border around it. And if we put a label on that field set, we'll see that label like customer information that we see at the top there. So over here we have one field set which has the label customer information, and over here we have another field set which says which has the label share your experience at Red Ball Pizza. And then outside of those field sets we have our two buttons. Okay, so we'll see that as we go along. There's a lot of different ways to build forms, so don't think the way we're doing it right now is the only way, because when you get to the assignments you'll see that he has you do it a little bit differently. And so you kind of learn a few different ways of doing things as you go along. So pay attention to what you're doing as you do it, and you know, pay attention to the code you're doing. Don't just do it by route. Just kind of try to understand what it is you're doing, so that when you see it being done differently, you'll say, oh, this is a different way that this can be done. Okay, but in either case, we need to put it inside of our form. All of our form elements need to be inside of our form. So inside of our form, we're going to have those two field sets, and we're going to put those in first. So it is called field set. That's the name of the element, and it has an opening and closing tag. And we're going to put IDs on those so that we can identify them. And so the first one is going to be called cust info. And we're going to have another one, so I'll just put that in right below it with the ID equal to exp info, for experience info, I guess. And there's our two field sets. If we look at our browser window, you'll see now there are a couple of borders, basically boxes with borders on them. Those are our field sets. Once we put things in, they'll get bigger, and once we put our label in, we'll see our label. Okay. The border does come by default, and the label will go overlapping the border on the top left-hand side by default. With CSS, you can change those things. You can take the border off if you don't want a border. You can change the color. The authors changed the color of the label, for example, so that it is red with white or cream colored text in it. That's in the style file. We're not going to play with that. It's already done. Okay. So we've got those two field sets there now, and we'll put some of our elements in there. But before we do that, we're going to give those field sets a label, which will identify that grouping. And we do that with an element called label. And it has an open and close. We don't need to give it an ID because it's the only label inside the field set. You can only have one label inside a field set, and it should be the first thing inside the field set. It is optional, so you don't have to have one, but if you do have it, it should be the first thing in the field set. So the first one is customer information, and the second one is share your experience at Red Ball Pizza. Okay, and now if we go and look at our browser, what did I do wrong? I'm sorry. It's not label, it's legend. I'm so sorry. That really... Legend. We'll be putting labels in our form in a minute. Labels are for each field, so I'm really sorry about that. Legend is what we want to name our field set, basically. So now I have to fix all four of those opening and closing tags. Sorry if you're following along. Legend. And now it looks like, kind of like the authors, it's up here. I didn't include the style sheets. I think I skipped that part. So I will go back and add the style sheets. that the author wants. Reset styles. Oh, are we going to do that? Okay. Maybe, I guess we're not doing that yet. So we will be styling that. That's good. Okay. Sorry. I did do this before, really. Okay. So field sets have a legend, and I'm sorry I said label, but it's not. It's legend. We will use label in a minute to label each field. So legend is basically belongs to the field set, and we'll style those later on. So each of our field sets has a legend, and you can see how that legend appears on top of the border at the top left-hand side of the field set. Okay, that's the default, and then we'll add some styling to give it that red background in a minute. Well, later on. But that's kind of where it goes by default. And so it makes kind of a nice grouping for your form. It's also important if you have a long form, like this one's pretty long by the time we're done it. If you use these field sets to kind of group things into smaller chunks, it's psychologically makes the form easier for a user to fill out. They're not put off by it. So if you just have a form with 20 fields that they have to fill out, they might just look at it and say, whoa, I'm not bothering with that. But if they're grouped in field sets, it kind of sets it off and they say, oh, there's just these two groups. It's kind of a mental trick we're kind of playing. Not only does it make it easier for the user to fill out, it makes it seem easier for the user to fill out. So you will find you'll get better response from forms if you use these field sets, unless it's just a very short form anyway, then you don't really need them. Field sets are optional. You don't have to have them at all, okay? But we're going to put all of our fields now into these two field sets, and then our buttons will go after the second field set, okay? So we will come to that later. So we will jump into our first field set, and after the legend, we will add our first field. Now, the most common HTML element to use in a form is called input. So it's an element called input. Now that input element is actually multi-purpose, okay? So let's take a look at it first and we'll see how that goes. So here, the first thing I will put is the name, which is the label text, okay? And then after the name, I'm going to put an input element. And if we could see both of these at the same time, maybe I'll try to drag this over a little bit. I'm trying to make things big enough so that you can see them, but small enough so you can see them both. So I just typed name in there. Now I've lost it. There it is. I just typed name in there, not inside any element, just inside the field set. And then I started to type an input. Now the input element is an empty element. And you can see as soon as I close it, we have a little border there, and I can actually click in there and type something, okay? So the input element will by default just create a text field, okay? And in fact, there is a type attribute that by default equals text, okay? Now there is a table in the book on page 528 that has a list of all the different type values for the input field, and you'll see that there are about 24, okay? There are a lot of them. A lot of them are still just text, but they're special purpose like email or something like that. But some of them do completely change the way this input displays. For example, checkboxes and radio buttons, or option buttons, as the author calls them, are also input elements in HTML, okay? So the type determines what type of input this is. Text is the default, so you don't have to put type equals text. You could leave that off, but I will be putting it on just to clarify that that type value is important. But most of your fields will probably be of type text, and so that's pretty handy that that is optional. Now, another field that is required is name. And the name basically names this piece of data when it is sent to the server. So when our form is submitted to the server, it's actually sent as name value pairs. So each field in our form has a name, and then whatever the user types into it is the value that will be associated with that. Okay, so when the server receives it, it will get a name, which is whatever we put in this name attribute, and the value, which is whatever the user typed in. Okay, so we are going to use the name cust name. Okay, now you can make these whatever you want. You can create your own names. The value of the name field just is whatever you want. Now, if you're not the person writing the server-side code, though, you have to agree with them on what these names are, because when this data is sent, that person receiving it has to expect certain names. If you are working with someone else and they're doing the server-side coding, you'll have to agree on the names somehow. Either you give them the list of names, or they give you the list of names, or you come up with them together. Okay, we're not working with anyone on the server. We have no server side, so it doesn't really matter what these are called. But it's each of the fields, each of the fields has to have its own name, its own unique name. Although we will see that some elements can repeat the name. We'll see that later on when we do the option buttons. Okay, now we will also need an ID, although ID is technically optional in input, but we will see that we will need an ID in a minute. And so I'm just going to give this the ID name, okay, and then the type text. Okay, I actually put these in a different order than the author did. He put type at the end. The order of attributes never matters, so whatever order you put them in doesn't matter. So I put type first. It doesn't really matter if type is first or last. Okay, so there we have our name and an input, excuse me, an input field. Okay, so we have a field and we can type text into it. So I can type my name in there. Okay, maybe I'll make that a little bit bigger if that helps. So I can type my name in there. Okay, so now I have somewhere I can type in. And this text in front of it helps describe what that field is, right? So I know what to type in there. Okay. Now the author has us put a whole bunch of them in there before we do anything else. But I'm thinking that what I will do is I will show you the label now before we put very many in. I think that kind of makes sense. So what we can do is, right now, this text that I have here, name, is not in any way associated with this input. Now, it's next to each other on the page, that's fine. But as far as the HTML is concerned, there's no relationship between those two. I just have this little bit of text and I have an input field, and they're just both there. As far as the browser is concerned, these have no relationship to each other. And one thing you can do to test this is you can click on the name and nothing really happens, okay? Once I associate the name with the field, if I click on the name, the cursor will go into the field because they are related to each other, all right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the label element to associate these two together. Now there's two ways to do this, and in this one we're only going to use one, so I'm going to show you the other one first. One way to do it is to put both the text and the field element inside of the label. Okay, so here I have the label, and then I'm just going to format it a little differently so that you can see I've got the label, and inside the label I have my label text and the field element, in this case an input. Okay, now if I come over here and click on name, you see my cursor appears in the field, and that's just one of the benefits. The other one is that they are logically tied now. So if somebody is using a screen reader, for example, they can't see the screen, the screen reader can help them if they like click in a field or tab into a field or something. the screen reader can read the label for that field. So they are now associated with each other, which is very important, okay, from a usability point of view, both for accessibility, people with access issues, or just even for regular people to help them use the site, the form better, okay? So that's one way to do it. The other way to do it is to only put the label text inside the label element. So now I'll just put the text on the same line and not indent, because now the label contains the label text, but not the input. Now, in this case, right now they are not associated with each other, but we can associate them by adding an attribute to the label called for, and then inside the for attribute, the value, given the ID for the element that we want to associate it with. Not the name, but the ID. So here, the ID is name, okay? The name attribute is actually custName. The ID is name, okay? In actual practice, it's actually fairly common to give the same value for name and ID. And in fact, the author used to do that in previous editions of the book. But I like that he's now using a different name and ID because it helps reinforce the fact that this for attribute matches the ID, not the name. Okay, and that is very important because when they are different, you have to match the ID. But I could have name equals name and ID equals name. That's perfectly fine. But then when I do the for, it has to be the ID, whatever the ID value is. It doesn't care what the name is. Okay, I hope that kind of makes sense. But that's why the author uses a name value that's different than the ID value. Okay, just to make it clear that the for associates with the ID. Okay, so the author is doing that for all of these fields. He will do this label with only the label text in it, and then the for attribute. Okay, it's kind of interesting. They give us two different ways to do it. And I don't really know which one's better, you know, it's kind of, I don't know how to suggest that. The way you style it, when you apply the CSS to your labels, or to your labels and inputs, will change because the relationship changes, right? If the input is inside the label, your CSS will behave differently, plus your selectors will be different. Whereas if you have them separate, then your CSS and your selectors are different. Okay, so that's just something to be aware of. We'll be doing this way. Okay, so we're going to put in a whole bunch of fields, and so I'm actually just going to kind of flush them out here. Whoops. I'm just going to kind of create a template. And then I'm going to copy and paste just to save some time. Okay. So I've got those two elements there, and I didn't fill anything in them, but I will. And I want to put in 6 more, so I'll copy that and paste it 6 times. Okay. I'm just saving myself some typing, and you know, this is kind of a good practice. Just make sure when you do it that you make sure you change or fill in everything that you need to fill in, right? Okay, so we have name. Also, another thing you'll notice is over here, you'll notice how they all just kind of flow beside each other, and that'll get even messier once we start putting label text in. So let me just add my label text. So the first one is name. The next one is street address. The next one after that is city. And then state, postal code, phone number, and email. Okay, so there's our form, and now we can kind of see that form taking shape over here. Both label and input elements are inline or text level elements. They just kind of go with the flow. They'll wrap like text does. So you'll see that the name, the labels, and the fields just kind of wrap in a mess. Okay, we'll be using CSS to fix that. Unfortunately, we're going to be using some CSS in this chapter that we didn't cover from a previous chapter, chapter 3 or 4, I forget which one it was in, called Flexbox. But we'll just use the code here, and then in the assignments, you're not going to use that, so it'll be okay. In the assignments, the author will give you most of the styling for the elements. So I will be using some styling in a bit that you won't have seen before. Okay, so let's just kind of go through this, and maybe we can get this done just before break. So we have name, and the street address, and it has the name, Cust Street, and the ID street. And so then the for value also has to match that ID. Okay, the city has the name Cust City, the ID city, and the label, the for value, to match the ID. The state has the name Cust State, and the ID state, and the for value state to match the ID. Postal code has the name Cust Zip, the ID zip. In the United States, they call postal codes zip codes, so I don't know why the author calls it postal code here. In Canada, we call them postal codes, but it's the same idea. It's just a routing number. And then our phone number, the name will be Cust Phone. The ID will be phone. And the for will be phone. And then email, the name will be Cust Email. The ID will be mail. Whoops, spell it right. M-A-I-L. And the for, again, to match the ID. Okay, so that kind of fills that out. Now, there's a couple of things here, and that is, if you look at that table, and I just realized I forgot to put my PowerPoint up, so I'll do that during break so that I can refer to my PowerPoint, because it will have some of these field names in there. So this input, I mentioned that for the type, there's actually a couple of dozen types of input types, I guess. And so even though these are all kind of text input fields, we can change some of the types so that when we go to do validation, it will help us do validation. Okay. So for the phone number, this is of type tel. This is also very important on mobile. Yeah, no, not so much. Yeah, actually, on mobile, what will happen is if you do the type tel or email, which is the, this one will be of type email because it's an email address. If you use the type on a mobile device or on a tablet with a touch screen or a virtual screen, it will actually change the keyboard for the type of data you're entering. So for example, if you have tel, type equals tel, you'll get just like a keypad with only numbers and characters that can be in telephone numbers. And for email, you'll get a special keypad for email addresses with only characters that can be in your email, including the @ sign, which you won't have to shift or anything for. So it makes it a bit easier to fill out on a phone or a touch screen device. Okay, because it'll change the keyboard. Obviously, if you have a mechanical keyboard, that can't be changed, but we will use this type as well for validation. Okay, so if there's any quick questions, I'll answer them. Otherwise, we'll take a break and come back in 10 minutes at 12 o'clock. So we're all good? Okay. So we'll take a break now until noon, and I will just put my PowerPoint up. So if you see the screen moving around, that's why, because I forgot to put my PowerPoint slides up so I could follow along with them. Okay, so I will reset my timer here, and I'll put that up when I'm done so that you'll know when I'll be starting again. All right, so I'll see you in a few minutes. Okay, so we will get started again. And I did get my PowerPoint up, so let's flick through. I won't spend any time on objectives. And I showed you the form and kind of talked through that, so we can skip a few of those slides. So here's some of the terminology. Controls, also known as widgets, which are objects that allow users to interact with the form. Each data entry control is associated with a data field. So we have fields that store the data supplied by the user. Okay, and then I kind of talked through the different types of controls, input boxes or text boxes, option buttons, or what are really called radio buttons, but the author calls them option buttons, selection lists where you have a set of items that you choose from, checkboxes, and text areas, which are those bigger boxes for adding stuff. And then some of the other controls, we use some of these in this project. Spin boxes or spinners is what the author calls the number values. And I think that's because on mobile devices, they will show up as a spinner that you can move up and down to select the number. On our page, they'll just show up with up-down controls that you can up-down them. The slider control, you'll remember that's the one that goes left to right. Calendar control, that's the date where you can pick a date off a calendar. And then there's also a color picker, which we won't be using, and I don't think I've ever used. It's not that often that you have your user choose colors, but I guess if you wanted them to be able to customize their web page somehow and choose colors, there is a color picker which brings up the operating system's color picker to choose colors, and then it just returns I believe it returns a hexadecimal color code, HTML color code for the color that they choose off the color wheel. Okay, we won't be using that one at all, actually, in the tutorial or in the assignments, but just know that it does exist. And then that's kind of a rough outline. Sorry, I have to jump through a lot of this because I did talk about it already. So at least the slides are there for your reference, and mine actually, because I forgot to mention this other ENC type, which is basically encoding type, how the data is actually encoded to be sent to the server. Usually we leave this off, but you do need to include it if you want to upload files to the server. Obviously, we're not going to be doing that because we don't have a server, but when you get to PHP, you might want to upload files to the server, and then you have to include the encoding type attribute to change the encoding to what's called multipart, where it can handle that. Okay. I don't think. Okay, yeah, the encoding type has 3 possible values. These are the 3 values. The first one is the default. And the text in your fields does get encoded so that if you have special characters in there, but the PHP or any other server-side language basically handles that automatically for you. So the way it's encoded doesn't matter really, except for this one, the second one, multi-part / form data. You need that type if you want to upload files. And there is an input type for files as well, to upload files, where you get to, browse for a file and then select it. So this is required if you need to do that, if you are uploading files. Okay, boy, we covered a lot of slides there. So there's the script that we included just to, this you don't normally need this script. The script is just to prevent the web browser from submitting to the server, to that example.com URL. So the script is only there for our convenience because we're not doing server-side stuff. When you get to JavaScript, you sometimes do have JavaScript interact with forms because you can do a lot more with that, but ultimately it does usually go to a server to be stored or processed or somehow dealt with. Okay, and this is kind of getting to where we are. So the field type the field set with the legend element to put that name on it. And so that shows that we've done, and then the input And then here's a list of types. Now, do they have them? Yeah, so it's 2 slides. This is slide 1. This is slide 2. Those are all the different type values that you have for the input element. So the input element is by far the most flexible element. It can be a lot of different kind of elements for us. Most of them are just look like a text field, but then have extra features like tell or email. They don't even show those extra features on a desktop computer, but they will bring up a different keyboard. But some of them are quite different, as we'll see, like checkboxes and radio actually create a whole different input. And even buttons, you can create them with submit. Type submit will actually create a button from the input element. So that input element is very multi-purpose. I suspect that when they first created HTML, they thought that that would be the only form element, but then they realized that some of the others are a little more complex and require more structure than that. So they did add a couple of others. So most of our form elements are input elements with a type associated with them. Okay, so we entered this code, and then we entered labels. So here's a little bit about the virtual keyboards, which I mentioned. Okay, then the labels, which we put around our label text, and that associates the text with the field, so that the browser knows that that label belongs to that field, and that helps accessibility and usability. Okay. So we add the labels, which we've done. Okay. And then this talks about the 2 different ways to label that I showed you, either including the input inside the label or just including the text inside the label, and then using the for attribute to associate it with the ID of the input or field element. It may not be a field element, it may be another element that we'll learn about. You can associate labels with those as well. Okay. Now, okay, so now we're where we've caught up to. So the input element can also take a value attribute, which specifies a default value for the field. Once the user starts filling the form out, they can change that value, but what it does is it basically pre-fills that field for the user. Now, just wondering. Okay. Yeah, I think before we get to the value, I want to do a little bit of styling here so that our form looks better. So what we're going to do is wrap each of these label and input elements in a div element. Now, I mentioned the div element back in chapter 1, but I don't think we've actually used it anywhere. The div element is a block level element, so it creates a block like a paragraph or a heading, but it's generic. It has no semantic meaning, so it doesn't describe our data. It's just when you need an element, but you don't really have a use for one of our, you don't have an element that fits that, you can use a div. And so it's div, okay, and we're going to give this a class. And we're going to call the class form row, and then close the div, and then put the closing tag after the input here. So here, and then I'm going to indent both the label and input because they're inside of the div, just to keep my formatting nice. Okay. Now what I want to do is wrap each of these groups in one of these divs. So I'll copy that div, and then in here I'll paste it in. And now what I'm going to do is a little tricky. I'm just going to copy the closing tag and the opening tag, copy them, and just insert them after each input. Oh, and I get an extra line in there, darn it. Oh, because there's already a blank line. That's okay. If I just select the blank line, yeah, that fixes it. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm closing each div and opening a new div. And I kind of wish I'd indented that before I did this, because that would save me some grief. And then the last one, I'll paste that in, but then I'll delete the opening div. Okay, I hope you followed along there. I'm going to have to go back and indent these now because I forgot to do that before I copied and pasted. So around each of my labels and inputs, I am putting a div with the class form row. And now you'll see that because that div is a block element, it now contains each of those label and inputs in its own rectangular block. And we'll be able to style the contents of that with using that. Okay. Now, I mentioned that we're going to use a CSS properties that we didn't cover called Flexbox. And so bear with me and just kind of, you don't really have to pay too much, you don't have to pay too much attention to this because we're not learning this, and it's not going to be in any of the assignments. So if I go to, actually, first I want to associate my styles. And right now I'm not seeing where the author did that, but I know that he did it. So up here in the link, I'm going to add another link. And it could be after the script tag, but I always put all my links together and all my scripts together. So my href will be rb underscore forms.css, and the rel is style sheet. And then we're also going to have another style sheet for validating. So I'll put that in right now. No, isn't there? Styles. Nope, sorry, there's just the one. On the assignments, I think he does them separately because he only has you do the validation, not the styling. Make sure I've got them all. So reset, styles, and forms. Okay, so the forms, I'll open that up because that's where I'll be adding my styles. Okay, so the layout styles is what we're going to do right now, and this is using Flexbox. So I'm going to select the div element of the class form row, and you'll notice that there's about 7 of those in there, so this will apply to each of them. And we're going to do a display flex. Display flex. And as I mentioned, we have not covered display flex, so this won't really make sense to you. And then I'm going to add a property called flex flow, which tells it how to flow the elements inside of that. And I'm going to say that they should flow by row and they should wrap, which means that if there's not room in one line, they should go to 2 lines. Okay, don't worry too much about that though. And then I'll also add a margin, which you're familiar with. And so the top and bottom margin will be 5 pixels and the left and right margin will be 0 pixels. Okay, so now you'll see we're starting to get not really too much, but now we at least have a little bit of room between our fields. They're not squashed up against each other. But we're also going to style the elements that are inside of our div with the class form row. So div.form row, and then we're going to say the direct children of this asterisk, which means any element that is a direct child. And you'll remember in our HTML, we only have label and input as direct child of the form row div. Okay, and so that's our selector. And then inside of there, we will say flex, and this is how the contents inside of the flex box gets styled. And we use flex 1, 1, 150. And just kind of, I'll just tell you what this does, but don't worry too much about it. The 150 says that the ideal width for this element is 150 pixels. The first 2 values are the grow and shrink factors. So if this is now flexible, right? So it's 150 pixels, that's kind of my ideal. but it can shrink or grow depending on how much room it has. And I want it to shrink or grow 1, a factor of 1, which means that both elements will shrink and grow the same. Okay. If I set these to 0, they would not shrink and grow. If I set one of them to 1 and one to 2, like set the label to 2, 2, and the input to 1, 1, then the label would shrink or grow twice as much as the label. Okay, but don't worry too much about that because I didn't cover it, and that would be a whole lecture in itself. So don't worry too much about this layout. It is covered, and I forget which chapter. I think it might be in chapter 5, which is called mobile, but Flex isn't really strictly a mobile thing. It's kind of a cool layout. Grid kind of does a lot of what Flex could do, but Flex still has some tricks that Grid can't do. So it's not, Grid is newer than Flex, but didn't make Flex obsolete. Flex is still quite useful. Okay, but don't worry about it because we're not going to cover it unless you're interested and want to read up on it on your own. All right, so now you'll see that this made our table layout, or sorry, our form layout really nice because now our labels and our inputs are the same width. Okay, we could have done this just by setting the width of them and doing that, but the author used Flex, so I thought, well, I'll just go with it since it's in the book, and I want you to be able to follow the book, even though we didn't do that part. So apologize for that. Okay. If there's any questions you can ask, although I'm not going to go into depth on Flexbox. Okay, so we will do a little bit of styling now. I mentioned the legend styling, so we will do that. So first, our form that has the ID survey. We will style that with a background color. Of RGB 241, 232, 181. And sorry, I got mixed up. So in our form, we don't want this color here. We want this in the legend. So I will put that in the next rule. It's going to be form survey space field set. And I said legend, but what I want to do is field set. And I don't know where I'm typing. Sorry, I want to add another rule here. Form survey field set. And I want to put that background color in there. Okay, so now you can see that the field set gets that background color. Okay, sorry, I typed that in and I didn't want to have to retype it, so I just jumped ahead to that rule. Now the form itself, the form element itself, we want to do a display flex on it as well. So we'll do display flex. And then we want to set the flex flow to row wrap, the same as our element. And you can have these flex boxes inside of flex boxes, so that's no problem. So these, anyway, so that's there. And then for the field set, I set the background color. Before I do, the first thing I'll do is do the flex, flex 1, 1, and then 300 pixels. Okay, and now you can see we have them on top of each other here. And I think if I make the box, if I make the page, the window wide enough, they go beside each other. But if the window's narrower, like if you're on a tablet or a phone, it will go to a single column. So it gives you a little bit of, that's kind of the idea of flex. So it won't go smaller than that, but it will wrap if you try to go too small. Okay, so there's the background. Now, another property the author throws in there that we didn't cover is border radius. And this one's really easy to understand, so I can just explain it to you. What we can do is round the corners. So you'll notice that we have a box there with a border on it. We didn't have to define the border because the field set automatically gets a border by default. But if we put a border on, this border radius would work as well. And then we just tell it what radius we want that border to be in. And we can use any of our units. The author uses 20 pixels. And you'll see as soon as I do that, our boxes now have rounded corners on them. Okay, so that's a really simple property that is easy to understand. Okay, so that's border radius, and it lets us put rounded corners on boxes. Rounded corners were all the rage, and so they added rounded corners in CSS to make it really easy, because it used to be really hard to do. You used to have to put images in each of the corner and stuff. It was really horrible. And then rounded corners have kind of gone out of favor. It's kind of funny. Once it's easy to do, no one wants to do it anymore. But they often look nice, and you can even give them like a smaller value, like 5 pixels, just to give it a little bit of a soft corner there, rather than 20, which is pretty exaggerated. Okay. Okay. Font size. And he sets the font size to 0.85 ems, so it makes it a little bit smaller than the default. And padding and margin sets a padding of 10 pixels. Whoops. 10 pixels. And remember, padding is inside the border, and margin is outside of the border. And he sets that to also to 10 pixels. So that just gives a little bit of room between our two field sets and between the field set and the edge of the container that it's in. And if I make that bigger, it'll put some space between the two. That's margin between the two. Okay. Okay, so hopefully you followed enough of that. Don't worry about the flex. So the flex flow, and the flex, display flex, flex flow, and flex. Don't worry about those. Just, they're not in the assignments. You won't have to use them. But the author put them in and did cover them in one of those chapters we skipped. So I just will use it without explaining it too much. But everything else there should be okay. Even border radius, even though we didn't cover it, that's kind of self-explanatory. So it should be okay. Okay. Now, on the slides, we were talking about default value. So this is kind of where we are now in the book. So defining default values and placeholders. We're going to look at these two things. So I mentioned these default values and placeholders when I showed you the original form. Where is it? It's gone. Okay. Anyway, so we can put some default values in there. So for example, the author had the city and state pre-filled in, so that when we load the form up, if I refresh this page, it would have the city and state already there. And so this pizza place is in Ormond Beach, Florida. So we're going to assume that most of our customers are from Ormond Beach, Florida, and set that as a default. Okay, so I'll go back to my HTML. So this is done in the HTML. I go down to our field set and find the city and state. So here's the city. Here's the input element for the city, the field that the user fills in. And we can just add a value attribute and give it the value that we want pre-filled there. So it'll be Ormond Beach. And now you can see Ormond Beach is going in there. And in the state, I'm going to do the same thing, just put a value equals FL, which is the code for Florida, for the state of Florida. Okay, so now if I go back here, you'll see I have those values. If I refresh my page, they're still there because that's the default. But I can say, well, no, I'm not from Ormond Beach. I'm just visiting Florida, which I wouldn't do right now in a pandemic, but I'm from Windsor, Ontario. So I can put in Windsor, and then for state, put in ON, which is the code for Ontario. Okay, and so I can change those values. So even though they are pre-filled, I can change them as the user filling out the form. If I refresh my page, it goes back to the default values. Okay, so that's kind of what's preloaded on the page. Okay. Now, the other thing we can do is placeholders. And placeholders are those gray values that I showed you that show up, but they aren't actually the value in there. They just show up so to help the user fill out the form. Okay, and we can do that, and we're going to do that on a few of these. And so for the name, we will add a placeholder, and you do this using the placeholder attribute. And then in the placeholder, you just type whatever you want to appear in that field. But it behaves differently than the value because it isn't a value. If I submitted the form with just the placeholder, the field is actually empty. So here, what the author says is first and last name. So it just helps the user fill that form out. If I go back here and try to submit it, it wouldn't submit because, well, this is blank. But if I type in there and type in my name, you'll see immediately the placeholder disappears. Whereas with Ormond Beach, I actually have to delete it. I'm hitting the backspace key to actually delete it. Just clicking in there doesn't make it disappear. But the placeholder only shows up when that field is empty. And it's just a clue to give the user an idea of what to fill in. It's not putting a value in there, okay? And so we're going to put placeholders also for postal code and phone number, just to give the user the idea of the format that we want. So postal code, we'll put a placeholder, and the placeholder will be NNNNN, and then bracket dash NNNN. Now this is US postal codes, which are 5 digits, and optionally they're 5 digits dash 4 digits. Okay, so the user can type in their 5-digit postal code, or they can type in their 9-digit postal code. Okay, the US started with 5-digit postal codes and then later added these like sub postal codes. So within a postal code, they broke it up into smaller areas because postal codes were kind of too big. So they kind of added this optional 9-character postal code. So I don't know if some people have 5 and some people have 9 and how that works because I don't live in the US, but that's how it is. The postal code is either 5 digits or 5-4 for a total of 9. So that kind of shows that the other digits are optional with the brackets. Okay, and then for the phone number, the author actually suggests using the placeholder bracket NNN bracket space NNN dash NNN like that. Okay, which is kind of how phone numbers used to be formatted. But what I would do is just go to NN dash. Okay, just like that. 3 N's dash 4 N's, because in Canada now we have to do, or at least in Ontario, I'm not sure how widespread it is, but we have to dial all 10 digits. It used to be the area code was optional. You didn't have to dial that, but they needed more area code, so they made 10-digit dialing required. So now you have to dial all 10 digits of a number. So really this is a better way to write it, and we will come back to that later on. But that's the idea of placeholders. So you can put anything in there, and it doesn't matter because as soon as I type, it disappears, right? So, and if I put it the other format, it doesn't stop me from doing that, okay? So I can do it in the old format. The placeholder doesn't prevent that from happening, okay? Or I could do it in the newer format, or I could even do it just without any dashes or brackets or anything. In fact, I could even type letters in there, right? The placeholder doesn't force me to follow that format. It just tells the user a suggestion for the format to follow, okay, if that makes sense. Okay. Are there any questions about that, especially about values and placeholders? That's the end of session 1. So I'm going to stop there today, even though it's a little bit early. So if you have questions, please feel free to ask them. Nobody's asked a question, so I'm kind of worried. Are you all there, or did you just tune in and walk away? Okay, so if there are no questions, then that's it for today, and we will pick up from here. I will post this before Monday, what I've done so far, so that you can, if you want to follow along, you can, and you didn't, you can start with what I have on, because we're just going to build on the same project throughout the at least 3 lectures. I'm hoping I can cover this in 3 lectures, but I wanted that 4th lecture just in case I go over time, so that we do make sure that we've got a Q&A session at the end of the following week, week 12. Okay, this is week 10, right? So this session, this module was actually scheduled for weeks 11 and 12, but I'm starting it a bit early just to give us a little extra time with it, or possibly finish a bit early. So if we finish early, then you'll have more time for your other courses crunching at the end. Okay, so if there's no questions, I'll stop the recording, and I will see you next time for the session 2.